Hello and welcome to Cardboard Critique.
Today we're going to take a look at Clank. Clank is a family-friendly fantasy adventure by Renegade Studios, in which 2 to 4 players venture into the depths of a dungeon to rob a dragon of its accumulated hoard of treasure, trinkets and offspring?
Less Baggins-esque burglar and more medieval miscreant, your goal is to stumble ignobly from chamber to chamber, snatching up whatever you come across. Whether that's one of the rare treasure artefacts that you need to complete the game, or an assortment of other items ranging from potions to dragon eggs. Presumably outside of the dungeon, you run either a giant omelette stand or a dragon smuggling ring? You can't or won't leave the dungeon until you've nabbed at least one of the rare treasure artefacts in the game. After which, once you've escaped, the game will count down a few short turns for everyone else to get out of the dungeon before the dragon goes completely off the deep end, incinerating anyone in the deeper depths. Once everyone's either out or has a new tan, you win the game if you have more stuff than everyone else.
At its heart, Clank is a deck builder. You start with a default deck, the same as everybody else's, and every turn you have the opportunity to buy new cards, either from the standard piles or from the dungeon row. The standard piles have basic cards that help you move around, buy more cards, or fight monsters. The dungeon row has the really good stuff, ranging from upgraded variations of the basic cards, through allies that give you a range of bonus actions, gemstones that give you a huge points payout at the end of the game, to giant monsters you can fight to get even more money, by which we mean points.
The dungeon row is also a source of anxiety because at the end of each turn it gets replenished, and if any card is turned over bearing the dragon icon, then the beast attacks, and anyone who's made any noise in the dungeon is in the running for a roasting. You see, the interesting thing about Clank compared to other deck builders is that you have to play all of your cards in your hand. All of them. If you draw a hand of cool cards, that's great, but some of the cards will give you that eponymous Clank, meaning you have to take a Clank cube in your colour and add it to the Clank space. Sometimes you might draw cards that let you remove some of this Clank, but when the dragon attacks, all this Clank goes in the bag and there's nothing you can do. Several cubes are drawn from the bag according to how angry you've made it, and if it's your colour, you've been damaged in the rampage and those cubes start to fill up your damage track. There are some black cubes in there that don't damage anyone, maybe the dragon takes it out on ubiquitous goblins, but if your row of cubes ever reaches the final skull spot, you die, get knocked out.
The Clank system is easily the most thematically congruous part of the game. You stumble, make some noise, add some cubes to the Clank space, and you can easily imagine your clumsy looter freezing in the darkness, holding his breath, waiting for some sign he might have been noticed.
When the dragon does attack, the more noise you've made in the dungeon, the more Clank cubes you'll have in the dragon bag when it does attack. It's a nice system, almost nice enough to counter the ridiculousness of the fact that occasionally you'll have 15 companions trooping around after you, making you look like the dungeon looting equivalent of a fast food manager offering 0 hours contracts in a subterranean death trap. Or the market seller who's set up a market stall below the soot line, who will inevitably be the first one in line for the barbecue when the dragon does eventually fly off the handle. Or the way that on some turns you might be able to fight off an army or hire one, and yet you just don't seem to be able to put one foot in front of the other to make it into the next room. Outside of the Clank mechanic, the suspension of disbelief that's required can be a bit huge.
For all those moments when Clank's theme feels disconnected from its mechanics, however, it's still good fun. Well, for a while. Clank has a couple of significant weaknesses, which prevent it from being a long-term fixture. The most obvious of these is replayability. The board is a fixed layout, so it's not going to take long for a group to find their favourite route through the dungeon, taking in the most treasure for the least risk, before games start to feel samey. Clearly Renegade was aware of this, since they provided a double-sided board. And the first expansion, Sunken Treasures, largely consists of another double-sided board. And then the sequel, Clank in Space, has a semi-modular board to increase variation.
Not quite so obvious is the fact that whilst the Clank mechanic feels pretty good, there are some times where it fails to have much of an impact on the game. There are some cards that force you to put Clank cubes in the Clank space and others that allow you to take it out. But ultimately, it all comes down to the luck of the draw, and there are occasions where the headline Clank feature falls a bit flat.
Clank is sometimes described as a push-your-luck game. The idea is you're daring to see how much noise you can get away with making and still get away with the treasures. And It is, but that really takes a back seat to the deck building, and that's just not as flexible as a lot of deck building games. There's a number of strategies you might employ. You might go for the mad rush, grabbing all the boot cards to run to the lowest levels of the dungeon and grab the high value loot. Or maybe you'll go for the passive aggressive approach, where you loiter near the surface, try and grab cards to give other players Clank, dipping into the dungeon only enough to grab the nearest of the required artifacts before you scarper.
But the player who methodically accumulates cards that give them the highest victory points, and more importantly, those cards that allow you to play more than the standard limit of 5 cards, will time and again run away with the game. And given that the dungeon row only ever offers 6 cards at a time, amongst experienced players, it's really going to come down to the luck of the draw. And to be honest, for a game that's themed around a daring raid into the deepest depths of a dungeon to get hold of the rarest, most dangerous artifacts, it's a bit of a strange and perhaps disappointing feeling to find yourself consistently beaten by the person who barely went beyond the castle pantry and instead spent the entire game gorging on the dungeon row. That's not to say that Clank isn't fun. It's pretty fun. It's just a fairly lightweight family game that doesn't really bear too close an examination. And despite the bundles of cards you get in the box and a really nice insert, it's just questionable whether it's really worth 50 quid. That said, with the recent release of Clank's successor, Clank in Space, you might be able to pick up the original on the second-hand market for a lot less. I guess it's really going to come down to which pasted-on generic board game theme you prefer the most. The one thing that Clank does have going its favour, though, is Renegade Studios' inclusion of a solo mode via its app.
If you're after a push-your-luck game that features players competing to get the best treasure and get out in time, you may like the recently re-released Diamante, or Ink and Gold, the card game version, which is essentially the same game. In this classic of the genre, players decide every turn whether to delve deeper into the danger-filled mine and/or South American temple, or escape with their share of the loot, before one too many dangers causes everyone to turn chicken and peg it without anything. Or perhaps you're after something a little bit more thinky and/or criminal, and you prefer 10-minute Heist, where players are looting a wizard's tower, one floor at a time, for set collection items, but they don't want to be left behind.
And if you're after a deck building game, well, any deck building game?
Hey, Dominion's good.
We're going to get comments about that. So what other Clank type games are you looking forward to then, Jed?
Clank in the Ancient World.
Ticket to Clank.
Ticket to Clank in a Bank.
Clankomobiles.
Clank Through.
Clankademic. I'm going to wait myself for Clanking in the Mediterranean.